Okay, so the chapter for this week from Clawson is chapter 11 that focuses on mining, manufacturing, and tourism. And what I have here is an outline of the chapter. The chapter first talks about mining and manufacturing chronologically, beginning with pre-conquest, so pre-Columbian, before the arrival of Europeans to the Americas. Then very briefly touches on colonial and republican, meaning during colonial times, republican is a reference to once they became independent republics, independent countries. But it doesn't go into those very much. The focus of the chapter is on modern day mining, manufacturing, and economic philosophies. And so that's where the focus will be on the pre-conquest and the modern day. And then at the end, it talks about tourism briefly in modern day. All right, so beginning with pre-conquest, mining and manufacturing. Native American people in the Americas mined. They would mine for stone. And so there's, the stone heads of the Olmecs. There's the stone bricks that that temples and pyramids and foundations were made of. The stone stele, etc., that the Mayans used. They would mine for jade. Jade, here's the rock, and then here's what they would make with it. There is obsidian. Here is this black stone, and then they would make a lot of tools, especially knives and sharp objects with that. And the knives made with obsidian, some people claim that they were sharper than modern day surgical knives. And so, we tend to underestimate what they could do with these things. Then there is the mining of things like gold or copper, of which they made tools or art or jewelry, etc. And then with regard to manufacturing, the making of things before the arrival of Europeans, three of the big things are textiles, for their clothing. There is pottery for the storage of water or for cooking. Then there's baskets for the storage of food, of grain, etc. And then there's other things not included on this list. Like there were, the people who dedicated themselves to making the weapons or making canoes and boats and so forth. And so yeah, they made things. Moving on to colonial times, uh, specifically beginning with mining, and then I'll get to manufacturing in a bit. One of the big things to know regarding colonial mining is that, we tend to focus on gold and how, with the stories of El Dorado and so forth. But by the end of the first century, the focus was on silver. And silver ended up providing the greater long-term yields compared to gold. And so it's silver that ended up being the most important for uh, the most important thing that was mined by the Spanish in the Americas. Most of the silver came from Mexico and from the Andes in Bolivia and Peru. So much gold came from the Americas that during this period, they provided half of the world's silver. There were 100,000 tons of silver sent to Spain. That's 100,000 tons of silver that benefited Spain instead of being invested in the Americas. And so then there's that irony that at the end of the colonial period, after providing so much wealth to Spain and the world, these countries got to start, a rough start being poor. So the silver ended up becoming important to the world. The Spanish um, coin of ocho, what was it? Ocho reales, I think it was called. That coin made with that silver ended up becoming the first global currency that was used to trade throughout the world. The Yeah, in obviously the Americas, in Asia, Africa, Middle East, Europe. So it ended up being important to the world. Continuing with mining, we get introduced to this idea of amalgamation, where the use of amalgamation allowed for them to be able to extract metals from ore that had a lower metal content, meaning, if they pull out pieces of rock that has some silver in it, with the amalgamation process, making use of mercury, it allowed them to be able to get that silver out of that rock, even when there was a smaller amount of silver in the rock. And this when you see this process, this was called the El Patio process for the amalgamation. There's people and animals, walking, stomping this slush with mercury in it, and so that is poisonous. We also get introduced to the mita minera. This was a labor system, especially used in the Andes, where the elite or the Spanish would have Andean Native American people. They would force them to provide 1/7 of their male population every year to work in the mines. And so 1/7 of the males in a community, in a tribe, in a town, each year would spend a year working in the mines for them. There are advantages and disadvantages to this mining. Towns and cities grew as a result of the mining, although mining towns tend to be boom and bust. They're booming while the mining is happening, and as soon as they run out, they go bust. And there's the improvement of roads, the improvement of ports, but it's only the roads and ports that are necessary for the exportation, the extraction of whatever they're mining. Some of the cons, there is deforestation. There is the poisoning of the soil and the streams. There is the decline, the massive decline of the Native American population, which is not entirely due to the mines. That is due mostly to diseases. We learned in a previous chapter how the decline of the Native American population is the most massive human decline in the history of mankind, with 90% of Native Americans dying, mostly due to disease. And these early mining towns also set up these unequal relationships, these racist relationships that ended up being codified in the caste system for 300 years. So just a map of where some of the mining happened. So Mexico and Peru and Bolivia. Gold and diamonds we have in the Dominican Republic, Honduras, Colombia, and Brazil. And then manufacturing we have in Mexico and Ecuador. And now manufacturing during colonial Latin America. And the only thing there you need to know is that obrajes is the term for the factories of the colonial period. So an obraje is a factory during the colonial period. For mining and manufacturing during the early Republican period, we don't really learn much, so we're not really going to cover much there. Here is some examples of the textiles that were made in pre-Columbian times and continue to be made for for people to make clothing. And this is where we'll be focusing on modern manufacturing. A lot of this associated with the middle of the 20th century and since, or the second half of the 20th century. And so these are the different things that'll be addressed. I'll address each one of them individually. So, don't feel rushed to write them all down. I'll make sure to get to each one of them. So beginning with laissez-faire economic philosophy, this is a French term that has to do with this idea that the economy works best when governments don't interfere. And for Latin America, there's some of the advantages, or people who advocate this idea talk about, that this helps lead to a lot of foreign investment in Latin America. It helps create jobs. They invest in the infrastructure, and that it's even helped create a small middle class. Some of the disadvantages or critiques of the application of laissez-faire economic philosophy is we've talked about enclave economies before. And so this idea that there are economic pockets that don't necessarily benefit the whole country. There's a lot of these economic pockets are essentially foreign owned. And a lot of these foreign corporations have more money than the country they're investing in. So they end up having enough money to corrupt everyone, all the leaders, to bribe all the leaders to get them to do whatever they want them to do. And whenever they resist, these strong corporations have the support of the United States and the United States military that then invade these countries whenever they try to resist what corporations want them to do. And so there's a lot of foreign intervention involved. And then there's tensions between the owners and the management and the people who work there. And these associations with local labor versus foreign elite management. Maybe I should also mention here that laissez-faire economic philosophy. Well, actually, no, I'll bring those things up later. All right. So something that developed with these places that used to be colonies, once they became independent, they ended up maintaining those neo-colonial relationships. And this, by the 20th century, became what is referred to by both of these terms, by the Core-Periphery and by the dependency model. The Core-Periphery is the idea that these places that used to be colonies became the third world or the periphery. And those places provide the cheap labor and the natural resources to the core. The core are the places that used to be the colonizers and today we would call the first world. And so during the 20th century, the core became industrialized. And so then the third world, which is the periphery, like Latin America, they became dependent on the core, on the first world. They would provide the first world, say, for example, Argentina has a lot of cows. Argentina sells the leather cheap to the first world, which has the factories. They make the boots and the shoes and everything else they make out of leather. and then sell those finished products back to Argentina at a higher price. And so there's this relationship where the natural resources are being extracted from the periphery, and the core is selling the finished industrialized product back to them at a higher price. And so the third world is dependent on the first world with this dependency model or core-periphery model. So now we get to import substitution industrialization. This is an effort to try to break away from this dependency model. And the way to do it is with the goal of becoming industrially self-sufficient, so that everything their people need, they can make themselves, and they're not dependent on importing those products from the first world, from the industrialized nations. They had a process to try to achieve this. This started happening in the 1940s and 1950s. And in order to do that, they had these stages to go through. There are 4 stages. The first one was to make things that are essential: clothing, medicine, and food. That's step 1. Step 2 is to move on to other consumer goods like stoves, TVs, stuff like that. Step number 3 is to be able to have their own industries that make the parts, the machines that make those, the first 2 steps. And then number 4 is the hardest one, and that is the steel and chemicals needed for heavy machinery. And so they had these 4 steps to try to achieve industrial self-sufficiency, so that they're not dependent on the core to import things from them. This would also be associated with things like tariffs or subsidies, where in order to get your factories to be able to compete internationally, you put these tariffs to try to protect, to make your products more competitive from the things that might be imported, to help them strengthen themselves and become more efficient and all that, or subsidizing. And we'll talk more about those after the test. It'll be to be continued. Next, economic philosophy that some countries worked on to try to improve their economies is the growth pole model. So if a lot of Latin American countries had economic enclaves, why fight it? Work with your strengths. With the growth pole is you continue to invest in that economic enclave, and eventually it gets so big that it'll start sprouting new secondary growth poles. And so you have all these, a main industry, you have related industries, you invest in this, eventually it grows to the point where there start to be additional growth poles, and then you invest in that one. And so that's just another theory for how to improve your economy, by working with what you got instead of starting from scratch. This chapter introduces us to 3 examples, 3 places in Latin America where they tried the growth pole model. One of those was Chile, where they made cars. Another one was Brazil, where they expanded their industry and they went on to large-scale agriculture. And then there's a focus on the third one, Venezuela, which had the most successful example of the use of a growth pole model. They did it in Ciudad Guayana, and they had a lot of success with it. And so, this also contrasts with Venezuela today, which also reminds us that Venezuela was doing pretty well economically a few decades back. And they're not doing well today. This is another topic that I introduce you to now and will be continued in the next chapter after the test. So some of this stuff will come back. And so that means that it'll be on this test and on the last test because we'll talk about it uh, during both periods. All right, nationalization is when a country takes ownership of natural resources or an industry. And so countries, we might have a nationalized library system, a nationalized postal service, or in Latin America, they'll have a nationalized airline, a nationalized public transportation like subway system or bus system, or nationalized telecommunications like the early phone systems, and so forth. So they're saying, okay, there are these different industries that are either essential, that everyone should have access to it, and that's good for all our people to benefit from, or there's a resource that should benefit the people of the country and not a foreign corporation. Now, there were a lot of countries in Latin America that by the 1980s uh, had been maintaining nationalized industries by subsidizing them more than they can afford. And so they fell into debt to such an extent that they couldn't afford to pay their debt anymore. So that's when the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the United States told them, we'll bail you out, but you need to privatize these industries. And the idea is, the government doesn't have the profit incentive to maximize profit and do things more efficiently, and the private industry does. And so that's part of the logic, an important part of the logic. But a lot of these things that were privatized were sold to corporations as monopolies, and that defeats the benefit for the people, because yes, a corporation will have the profit incentive, but that just means they'll charge as much as they can get away with charging. Because if they don't have any competition, if your only choice for telecommunication, for phone service is just one company and they don't have competition, then they can charge whatever they want if you want to have that service. And so we'll talk more about that later, but of how they didn't get the benefits that they should have gotten from privatization because of those monopolies. So here's the example of Mexico nationalizing their oil with the company called Pemex, which stands for Petróleos Mexicanos, Mexican petroleum, Mexican oil. They nationalized it in 1938. This is the next economic philosophy. Not only, this is the idea, okay, well, not only should we become industrially self-sufficient so we don't have to import things, but what if we specialize in some things and make them and export them, do what the first world has been doing? It's a nice idea, but in reality, it never worked out that way. Of, third world countries exporting their manufactured goods for their own benefit. And that's in part because this model ended up being used by the corporations in the first world, in the core, from the beginning. And so the first example we're given is Operation Bootstrap in Puerto Rico, where US companies were given incentives to build factories in Puerto Rico to take advantage of those incentives and, lower taxes and, lower labor costs with lower wages, etc. Now, to be fair, to this initial effort, those jobs did pay well, and those jobs were unionized jobs. But, corporations ended up turning this model into a race to the bottom. They start off in Puerto Rico with unionized jobs, but then they realize, hey, Mexico is closer. And Mexico, the jobs there are not unionized. And so let's instead go to Mexico. And then after that, they're like, hey, we can get even cheaper wages and less labor protections and less environmental protections if we go to China. And then after that, they're like, hey, well, Vietnam or the Philippines is desperate for manufacturing, so we'll just move there, and etc. It triggered this race to the bottom. That begins with Puerto Rico, then moves on to Mexico. Now, Clawson's discussion of maquiladoras is very confusing, so I hope to clarify it so that you're not confused. It brings up maquiladoras, which are factories or assembly centers. And then it starts by talking about the Bracero program. But the Bracero program did not have any maquiladoras, hence why it's confusing. The Bracero program was an agreement between the United States and Mexico that started during World War II because the United States had a labor shortage. So the US and Mexico agreed to import workers from Mexico to the United States, braceros, to work in the United States. In the United States, they worked in agriculture and railroad building. After the war, the agriculture industry liked the program so much that they lobbied Congress to renew the program year after year, way beyond the end of World War II, all the way until 1964. No maquiladoras are part of the Bracero program. Maquiladoras don't come into the picture until after the Bracero program. When the Bracero program ends in 1964, Mexico starts the border industrialization program in 1965. At that point, Mexico provides US corporations an opportunity. They can build factories within 10 miles south of the US-Mexico border to take advantage of Mexico's lower labor expenses, labor costs. They do require that they be within 10 miles of the US-Mexico border, and they also require that at least 27% of these assembly centers or maquiladoras be owned by Mexicans. And so there's that limitation. So that's where these factories or assembly centers start, US corporations start leaving the United States, moving their factories to Mexico in the 1960s and 70s and 80s to take advantage of less labor protections, less environmental protections, no unionization, etc. And this gets augmented with NAFTA in 1994. And we'll be talking about NAFTA again in the next chapter. So I'll talk about it now and it'll come up again later. NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement, an agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico to make it easier for corporations to move capital and products across the borders of the three countries. And with NAFTA, corporations, the factories, the maquiladoras no longer had to be just along the US-Mexico border. They can now be anywhere in Mexico. And now they didn't require any Mexican ownership. Now they could be 100% US owned in Mexico. And then during the first Trump administration, he modified NAFTA and renamed it. It's now the USMCA for the United States, Mexico, and Canada agreement. It's NAFTA with some minor modifications. I'll talk in greater detail about those modifications later on for the next test, but a version of NAFTA still exists today. One of the things that happened with these maquiladoras and this gets augmented with NAFTA is that Mexico could no longer subsidize things like their corn, which is a staple food item in Mexico. And so there were lots of corn farmers in Mexico that were no longer protected by subsidies and tariffs with this free trade agreement. And so these small farmers in Mexico could not compete with big agribusiness in the United States. So they lost their ability to subsist on growing farm. So they left their farms, moved to cities, moved to the US-Mexico border to try to take advantage of these jobs being created by these maquiladoras. But the maquiladoras hired 80% of the people they hired were women. And so there were families who moved to the border to take advantage of these jobs, and the women would be hired and the men would not. This created a lot of unemployed men who crossed into the United States illegally. There was a wave of illegal Mexican migration during the 1990s, especially after NAFTA. And so we have a wave of undocumented Mexican migration to the United States. And then the women who stayed behind working on these maquiladoras were running 3 8-hour shifts, 24 hours a day. These women being bussed into the maquiladoras, and they ended up becoming the targets of criminals, of drug cartels. There were 327 women after 1993 and after who were found dead, raped, and mutilated, and 4,000 women that were disappeared and never found. And this will also be continued, something that we'll come back to. I just don't want to forget to mention it. There are some countries that stand out for manufacturing. Brazil and Mexico manufacture more than any other country in Latin America by far. Brazil and Mexico. You can see the industrial zones in Latin America. We have the US-Mexico border. We have Monterrey, where they make a lot of cars for the US. We have close to Mexico City. They also make a lot of cars. We have Colombia. We got Chile. We got Argentina and Uruguay. We have in Brazil, Venezuela, and Puerto Rico. And so yeah, just some of the top industrial areas. For energy, I don't have much regarding petroleum and coal. I'll point out one thing regarding hydroelectric power, and that is that Paraguay has, some places really take advantage of their hydroelectricity. That's where you put up a dam on a river, create electricity from that. Paraguay gets 100% of their electricity from hydropower. Let's see, for three top countries for petroleum and natural gas are Brazil, Mexico, and Venezuela. And then for renewable organic fuels, Brazil has long been a leader, and we'll come back to this in the next chapter as well. The United States has been using a lot of products that come from corn since NAFTA. You know, we basically made corn so cheap that we've had to come up with new uses for it. Two of those big uses are ethanol, which now our gas has, most of the gas we buy has 10% ethanol. Um, and the other one is high fructose corn syrup, which now, you know, the cheapest way to sweeten things is high fructose corn syrup. So a lot of our sweeteners are, a lot of the things that we eat that are sweetened with high fructose corn syrup. But Brazil has been using ethanol for their vehicles for 100 years. And so they've been doing it for much longer than we have. Last point regarding this chapter having to do with tourism. For international tourism, you know, kind of similar to some of these other topics where, you know, you have international tourism, they go to resorts. At the resorts, they're often foreign owned resorts. And so a lot of this international tourism, you know, the international tourists spend money that just goes right back outside the country to some international corporation. The infrastructure that gets built primarily for the tourists. And they've also, you know, been doing it in a way that's not very sustainable. Today there's a greater focus on ecotourism, so that with ecotourism, you know, they'll limit how much, how many tourists can come in, how many can go into a national forest, so that they don't destroy the place that people are coming to visit. And, you know, greater effort at supporting local owners of these different places, so that it's less about benefiting international corporations. All right. Any slides to go back to, information to repeat or explain?